Look at how fun and Victorian my shirt is today. How are you? I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going to talk about some watercolor stuff. Specifically, we're going to go through and we're going to compare two palettes. One generally inexpensive and one a bit more pricey. This one, which I believe I got from either Hobby Lobby or Michael's and only paid about $2.50 for. It's a 12 color palette. It's very cheap, thin plastic. There's two areas for mixing your colors and a very nice small brush. I do really like the brush in this one. And this one, which is a 36 color palette from Arteza, which is worth about $30 depending on where you buy it. So more than 10 times as much. Affiliate links in the description. I love this palette so much. I've had this for almost 2 years and I have barely made a dent in any of the colors. Recently I've realized I prefer standard brushes to these, but these are very good for distributing water on your palette. I also love how this case is designed because the lid forms 4 areas for mixing color, as well as the fold out, which has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different little slots that you can mix and play with your colors in. An investment. I've had this palette for quite a while. I really like it. So first things first, let's have a look at the art that I made for this video. I wanted to use these palettes to their fullest capacity, so I decided to make kind of like a rainbow anime girl. It was something that I knew I could do relatively well and would allow for a lot of detail. One thing I did with this that was a little bit different than my normal process was that I went ahead and I did the line art first. Usually I will make a light sketch and then paint and then put my line art on top, specifically when I'm working with watercolor. Otherwise the water has the potential of running the ink, and so I usually just put the line art last to completely avoid that. So because the cheaper palette is a bit smaller, there are a lot fewer color options to work with. So the first thing I started with was the skin color, because that's going to be one of the lightest palettes that I put on this, and it also has to be a very specific color. It can't be too yellow or orange, and it can't be too pink, it can't be too saturated or too desaturated. And I needed to start kind of light because that's something that's going to have a lot of highlights and shadows, so that means there's going to be a lot of layering. One thing that I will say the smaller palette has over the 36 color palette is that there's a white pigment. Having a white pigment makes mixing colors much easier because you can make more vivid pastels without just having to rely on the white from the paper underneath the color. The brush that came with the set was actually really nice. The fibers are a good quality. It's clearly meant for watercolor. And also, it's relatively small, which makes putting detail a lot easier. Of course, because this is an anime girl, I decided to give her very cerulean blue hair. Mixing these pigments with water was relatively easy. Not as easy as the Arteza set, but still relatively easy. One of the major downsides to this was that there was no purple or magenta, so I kind of had to mix my own violet colors. So I decided to make the eye purple because it meant that I was going to have to make my own. Given how limited the really small palette is, it's really not that bad. One thing I noticed almost immediately when I started working with the Arteza palette is that the pigments are so much smoother. The cheaper palette almost has this grainy chalk texture to it that is just nowhere near as smooth as the Arteza palette. One of the reasons I decided to start with the smaller set is that starting with a more limited palette was going to be easier to replicate with the large diverse palette that I have. Also, on top of being a lot smoother, the pigments are much more vivid. I was able to mix a ton of custom colors because I have so much space and there's so much more options. Everyone loves options. And then of course I had to throw in lots of purples and magentas because it's flexing the benefits of this palette. I did accidentally mix a little bit of yellow into the cerulean blue for her hair, so if you look at the top, it's kind of green, just a tiny bit. So the black in the Arteza set is really strong. It's a really, really pigmented black. Whereas in the smaller set, it almost felt like a charcoal kind of color, but that meant that it was a little bit easier to add layer after layer, versus with my really fancy palette, it's kind of one and done. Once you put it down, that's where it is. Probably the biggest downside to the expensive palette is the fact that it doesn't have a white pigment, which meant that I couldn't put the highlights on the left eye in the way that I did on the right. The background felt a little empty, so I decided to put some light, bright pink dots. On the left side, they definitely look more magenta and pink, whereas on the right side, for the cheaper palette, it almost looks like bloodstains. Of course, because the only way that I could make pink from the smaller palette was with red. And I feel like rather than looking like a bright pink, it looks just like a light red. Light red has almost like a brown bloodstain kind of color, and that's what the dots on the right look like to me. They don't look like a fun, vivid pink. Conclusion time. Is this worth $2.50? Yeah. Is this one worth $30? Yeah, I feel like this is pretty much just a you get what you pay for. However, the value gap is not as big as the quality gap. This is an incredible palette. This one is extremely limited and hard to work with. This just makes things much easier. Is it $25 easier though? I would say yes if you're actually using it. Considering I've had this for almost 2 years, that's a 2-year investment for $30. This is something that I'm gonna have for a really long time. If you're new to watercolor and you just kind of want to dip your toes in and play around, I very much recommend something like this. Just a cheap, simple, straightforward thing to play with. This is a great start, but if you want to do watercolor long term, or you're planning to do multiple watercolor paintings and get really good at it, I recommend getting something a little bit more substantial, like this 36 color palette. Once again, affiliate link in the description. Personally, I like having both, because I can use the brush and the white palette from this, and also have the color variety of this one. It's a win-win for me. I like watercolor. Watercolor is fun. This entire painting took roughly 3 hours from initial sketch to final painting. I try to upload on Mondays. We'll see if I can keep that schedule. A big thank you to my patrons for helping this channel stay alive. I'm gonna be turning this picture into the sticker for this month for my high tier patrons. Thank you for hanging out with me today. You get 1,000 awesome points for making it all the way to the end of this video. I love you, and hopefully I will see you again next time. Goodbye! Also, I'm probably going to be making a drawing random things as anime girls video soon, so if you would like to participate, suggest something that you would like me to turn into an anime girl in the comments below. I'm like a bat!